والله كان انا لي قريب اسبوع هذه في الرحله المره هذه والله كان في وسط الجماعه رياض طويله كانوا موثوقين في شحات.
Welcome to this Al Jazeera news special, Libya on the Line, the War Retold. I'm Nick Clark. 10 weeks ago, Al Jazeera obtained the mobile phone wiretaps of two members of Muammar Gaddafi's inner circle. The phones were the property of, firstly, this man, the Prime Minister al-Baghdadi al-Mahmoudi, and secondly, the long-time Gaddafi loyalist Tayyip el-Safi. In all, more than 12,000 conversations were intercepted. Both men were in regular contact with Gaddafi himself, his sons, and even members of the international community. And these conversations took place between February and June of last year, the same time that Libya's opposition rose up against the Gaddafi regime. Our team went through them all. For the first time, we know the other side of Libya's story in the uncensored words of Gaddafi and his associates. Hoda Abdelhamid has our first report.
Gross violation of basic human rights will not be tolerated.
The use of armed forces. Quello che sta succedendo in questi giorni in Libia.
His intelligence and security forces.
نبيذ تحريض على الخروج في الشارع وباش الشباب هذوم يسحبوا على النصاب.
Whether it's a civil war or not, what we can.
يجيبوا الكلاب عندكم يدوسوا عليهم يقولوا لهم انتم يا خونه اللي بتجيبون الانجليز انتم لكم من نحن ولا حاجه يجيبوكم الانجليز ولكم.
Gaddafi survived for 42 years by keeping a tight grip over the country. One of the most obvious ways was to record and listen phone conversations. Now, after the fall of Tripoli, it became clear that it was not just the average Libyan that was being monitored, but also members of his inner circle. Thousands and thousands of phone conversations give you an insight in how they dealt with the uprising, what they were trying to do to prevent Libya from slipping from their hands, and also, sometimes, how they personally felt about the conflict. Publicly, Gaddafi appeared to be eccentric and defiant. Privately, his tone was often more measured, even caring with his close associates.
مرحبا سيد، اهلا وسهلا. كيف حالك؟ وين انت؟ قاعد والله في طرابلس. كنت غادي راهم يذبحوك على طريق الطرابلس. يقول لك على المنفى. اين اقول؟ المنفى لازم تدبر فيهم كيف الصبر هذه لازم تكون مضمونه وتكون معنا والاعلانات الخضراء والكيف. اول حاجه في بير الاشهر في منطقه المنفى راهم معديين العالم الخضر معلومات. طيب الصافي عندما طيب الصافي يقول.
When Tayyip al-Safi says that Bir al-Ashab supports him, he is pulling his leg. You know these places? They are tiny villages with about 10 people. So Tayyip is fooling him, or maybe just giving him an answer to get him off his back.
Because those who knew him well knew how unpredictable their leader was.
انضموا مع بعضكم ودافعوا عن المنطقة واللي يقربكم اعطوه النار وخلوا العالم الخضر وديروا شعبيات غادي.
Awad Hamza met Gaddafi back in the 1960s when, as young officers, they plotted to overthrow King Idris. But soon afterward, the friendship ended and Awad spent 36 years under house arrest.
He was like Machiavelli. He was willing to approach anyone with any type of a deal. The aims justified the means, as long as he stayed in power, him and his sons.
This Gaddafi was more apparent during conversations with members of his government.
والله ما عرفت يعني أنا كلية بالذات رئيس الوزراء يعني مشي بعيد بكل يعني سوا ودعمناهم كان عندهم أزمة مالية وحطينا عندهم حتى ودايع ولكن انقلبوا قلبة واحدة خاطبوهم قولوا لهم انتم ما كنتوش مقدمين مصالحكم وحتى احنا بس نعترف بالباطل. بالضبط هددهم به ونعترفوا بالأندلس.
In hiding, Gaddafi appeared more and more isolated. Several conversations reveal a man trying desperately to cling to a reality that was not there anymore.
ما قلتوش بالسيرة خضراء ولا قلتوا فيها. هذا كله على الداخلي في الخارج هو المهم. باهي هو من اللي بالخارج، احنا ما من في الداخل. لازم حتى بالخارج تبينوا المسيرة خضراء، بيشتغل في عشرات آلاف الليبيين زي مبارك الشامخ. تو يخطر عليك حاجة زي كذي؟ ما في بالك. ها؟ حبال وطيح ساعات يقول الموت. والله الأحباب. أنت هو أمين مؤتمر الشعب العام. شنو كان يحلم هو؟ تو شنو يبي بعد؟ والله اللطيح ساعات وحباله وما عنده عقل. تو كان يديرها واحد رجعي، واحد غني، واحد من الإخوان المسلمين، واحد من الزناقة، واحد من الفاشيين اللي بالسلطة. أما فيها واحد زي هذا. جايب عليه حتى قامش الحرة، هو الحرة بتاع المخابرات الأمريكية، وين هو؟ وين الناصرية؟ وين الثورية؟ وين القومية العربية وتحرير فلسطين والوحدة العربية؟
هو كان عنده إحساس.
He had the feeling that people would never let him down. He could not imagine Libyans being against him. He was under the impression that the problems could be solved.
But the only solution that would satisfy the Libyans was Gaddafi's removal from power. Abandoned and on the run, he died in the hands of those he had vowed to crush.
Well, it is an extraordinary insight, isn't it? Hoda joins me now, along with Jalal al-Galal, former spokesperson for Libya's transitional government that took over from Gaddafi last year. And Jalal, first of all, what effect do these tapes have on you when you listen to Gaddafi's voice? You were there throughout the conflict.
Well, just listening to them right now, it strikes fear still in me. His messages were always delusional, threatening, and it obviously had an effect on us. But as time progressed, we destroyed the fear barrier, and then they started getting worried. I think that's the essence of it. With the small successes that we've had, momentum built, and then euphoria ensued, and it seemed us on the upper hand while he was beginning to get fearful about losing what he had.
Right, so it was going in reverse ways, really, for both sides, wasn't it?
It was.
Hoda, from your point of view, 12,500 recordings, an extraordinary amount of work went into it. What was it like going through them all?
Well, I have to say the first reaction was, gosh, what do I do with this? Then I asked my Libyan friends, I said, come, listen to this. So we started clicking randomly through these clips just to figure out whether they could recognize these voices, whether they thought, you know, when the person saying that he's Gaddafi is really Gaddafi, was it really Saif al-Islam? And they had no doubt whatsoever that it was them. Then, as we went through them, a lot of the situations they were talking about were situations I had witnessed. I was on the other side, covering the other side, so I could relate to what they were saying, to the details. And the conversations are just one follow-up after the other. This is 24/7. So you have the conversations about the conflict, you have personal conversations, you even have sometimes the wife who calls a senior official says, on your way back, can you bring me some milk? Or
right, so the more mundane side of life. So
absolutely,
yeah.
Everything was there. And then I think, you know, no matter how good you are at propaganda, and Gaddafi was very good at it, you possibly cannot really fabricate all this.
Right.
This is not possible. There's too much in it.
Absolutely. But there are conversations that are already on the web, aren't there?
Yes, because what happened is that these conversations were actually the system recording itself. So after the fall of Tripoli, the war was still going on. Some of the fighters took some of these conversations and just posted about a few dozens on the internet, specifically ones that were there to prove or to keep the momentum of the war. You still had to find Gaddafi, you still had to find Saif al-Islam, you still had to continue. Libya was not liberated when Tripoli fell. But the conversations we have are completely different than the ones that are on the web. Really.
Right, and another thing that really struck me was the large number of informants that the Gaddafi regime had everywhere, in all parts of the country. And from your point of view, Jalal, it must have been difficult to know who to trust, wasn't it?
Well, it was. It was very difficult. From the very beginning, we knew that he had supporters. We couldn't gauge the number. We hoped there were not as many as we found out later, the number to be. But they existed, and we called them the fifth column. and they were among us, they have infiltrated us, and they still exist until today, even in the National Transitional Council and in the government.
I just want to add one thing. You had people calling from the operations room of General Abdel Fattah Yunus. That should be the most secretive place in the hands of his own tribe. You had the driver of Mustafa Abdel Jalil calling Tripoli as late May, if I remember well. I mean, at every point they kept these people, and these people were telling them everything. I was actually quite surprised listening to these wiretaps that we were safe, because us journalists, we were advancing on the Eastern Front thinking that that was completely in the hands of the opposition. It wasn't.
All right, thanks, Hoda. Tayyip el-Safi, one of those on the tapes, had been a close confidant of Muammar Gaddafi for at least 20 years. He held the position of Minister of Trade in the past, but it's thought most of his main duties were covert. He was posted to Europe in the 1980s when Gaddafi was running an assassination campaign against dissidents overseas, and he emerged again as protesters rose up against Muammar Gaddafi.
نعم حاج طيب كيف حالك؟ أهلا حالك باهي؟ الله يسلمك الأخ قايد يبيك ماشي خليك معي
Tayyip al-Safi was one of Muammar Gaddafi's closest henchmen.
شنو هذا وقت؟ وانت وين الثوريين 40 عام ونخرف عليكم لا لا انت لما كيف القطوس كنت صغير نربي فيكم شو اسمها هي؟ لا عندك حق لا عندك حق شو اسمها هذيك تاجورة ولا شنو؟ صح هيك لابس بدلة الرياضة وجيتك وشديت لا صح شرط من طيب لا صح
Tayyip al-Safi was respected and trusted by Gaddafi's son and heir apparent Saif al-Islam.
واليوم غادي انت كبير المدبرين عندنا.
But Tayyip al-Safi was largely unknown to the outside world. Even among Libyans, he's a bit of a mystery. Few knew who he is or what he was doing.
Tayyip al-Safi, I never heard about him before. I only heard about him in this revolution.
I know that he was with Gaddafi, but that's it.
I only heard about him just now, during the revolution, that he is one of Gaddafi's associates.
Still, he played an important role throughout the conflict. One of the very few men who had the power to issue orders of his own. He was in Benghazi when the uprising began. The audio recordings make it clear that Tayyip al-Safi was in charge of containing the rebellion here in the east by any means possible. In fact, it's from this building that he was directing operations until it was overrun by protesters.
أنا في تقديري الآن هم قال الشرطة تروح تضرب عليهم دائرة ما يكلموهمش يقطعوا عليهم دائرة. المواجهة توا يبدو لي مش صح الليلة. يا اما تكون مواجهة قوية وعنيفة يا اما تكون في مواجهة عرفت؟ اوكي. يا تكون في مواجهة عنيفة وقوية لا من أنا أتحدث. لكن المواجهة البسيطة عبارة عن تأخذ عواطف الناس تقريبا يتفرجوا أنا أتحدث من اوكي.
But Tayyip al-Safi didn't follow this advice. Instead, he colluded with the head of intelligence, Abdullah al-Senussi, and went back to the same old methods used over and over again to quell Libyan aspirations.
وانا والله كنت مصر انهم لازم يمشوا وانا عيطت قلت لهم يا جماعه ما تعبوش كلموهم يقول لهم انتم كانت همكم بغازي ترى احنا عند الضروره وبنمارس الساحل ونمارس صح يعني بنواجه اي حد بقوه ترى يا عبد الله حتى قايد يقول لا لازم بغازي تكون تحت السيطره ما تفكوش الامور يا جماعه الله يهديكم يقولوا كان ظهرتوا قوتكم هذول يخافوا كل واحد يقول في جحيم.
But his read of the situation was flawed. Protesters had broken the fear barrier. The red line was crossed.
الكلام كده حتى على القاعده وين الحريه واللي قتلوا الاولاد اللي طلعوه ونحن ما عادش نستنوا ويعتزموا في الوقت بتاعهم ما ونخش عليه ما طيب لوحدين نزل ثوريه جوهريه ما طيب حرام بالضبط.
يعني في الاول كان الكلام اللي بيجينا يعني.
At first we were hearing that people were not calling for the removal of the regime. We were told they had demands. A delegation was sent to Benghazi to listen to the people. It's probably that trip that went wrong. They were supposed to solve the situation, but it turned to violence.
Benghazi fell within 5 days. Tayyip al-Safi moved to the capital, and until the very end, he continued to plot and scheme with his vast network of informants for the return of the regime to the east.
وردوا بك وتفكروا كيف تدعموهم ماديا ولا بأغذية ولا نيرة كلام فاضي. هذا ربك خلوهم يجوعوا وخلوهم يعانوا. تفضل لك كل شيء موجود لكن مش قادر نوصله. مانيش قادر نوصله لك. ايوه بالجوال هي يعني خليها ايش كما يقول تنتعش يصير يعني التركيز يتم عليها بحيث انهم يعرفوا هم ان اللي لهم قريب اهم واضح تم تحسن معهم. اوكي تمام.
والله جيش ولا بسوم تبشحت الكاسة هي النفس عادي. جيش النفس تبشحت هذه باقي لنا شرطة. منتزل الصحفيين كلهم عرفوا يا سيدي وحتى الرئيس اوباما دواء على الزاوية الحياة في الحياة. هذه المدارس، هذه السلع التموينية، هذه الحياة الطبيعية، هذه الأدوية، هذه المستشفيات، وهذه شرطة عادية قاعدة زي في كاليفورنيا.
هو كل واحد يجيب روحه. وإحنا شرطتنا وعملنا وتطلع الله إن شاء الله. وأنا عايش وأنا واقف والموت وأنا واقف. السلام عليكم. السلام عليكم. الموت واحد ما واحد شفته.
But the power and force didn't work. Tripoli fell 6 months later, and Taib Safi slipped away. He's currently living in Egypt, but Libya's justice minister wants him back to stand trial.
He was fighting against the revolution. He worked with the regime to ignite the war and commit acts against Libyans. We made a request to Interpol and we wait for governments to hand these people over to us so they can be judged on Libyan soil.
Taib Safi is not the only one. There's a long list of senior members of the former regime who have fled the country. They might not be known internationally, but Libyan people know them very well. And now that there's more and more information about their alleged crimes, there is growing pressure to bring them to justice as soon as possible. Investigators and lawyers have been gathering evidence and building their cases against dozens of members of the former regime.
We cannot build a state without a strong justice system. How do you build a country with everyone on the run? People will know that former regime members were not brought to justice, and that sets a bad example. They will ask why they didn't face trial.
It's a tricky matter. The search for justice can easily slip into a witch hunt after a civil war such as Libya's. But the leaders of the new Libya have little choice. Transitional justice needs to be a top priority for the country to move forward.
Well, we know the whereabouts of most of Gaddafi's inner circle. Here they are. And as we heard there, Taib el-Safi, he's in Egypt, and Libya's transitional government has asked for him back. Then you have the former Prime Minister, al-Baghdadi, al-Mahmoudi. He fled to Tunisia. Gaddafi's head of intelligence, Abdullah Sanusi, is in Mauritania. Abdullah Mansour was the head of Libyan state TV, the main tool for Gaddafi propaganda. He's in Niger. Then Gaddafi's head of internal security, that's Mansour Dao. He's in Libya, in jail in Misrata. And then, of course, there is Saif al-Islam, Gaddafi's son and heir apparent. Very much the man of the moment. He's in Libya in the custody of a militia in Zintan. The government says it wants him to face justice on Libyan soil, but the International Criminal Court wants to try him too. Earlier this week, I sat down with the ICC Chief Prosecutor Luis Ocampo to see what these Libya recordings could mean for the case against Saif. So, Mr. Ocampo, we went through these tapes and we'd like to have your advice as Chief Prosecutor of the ICC. We found one or two clips that are pertinent to Saif, and this particular one that we're going to play you was from March 2011 between Saif and Taib el-Safi. Have a listen to this if you would.
انتبهوا خارج جمال عبد الناصر ان اميرها راح تامر وفي بعض الضباط الكويتي. ايه عارفينه. مرات يطلعوا طيران ولا يدروا شي حاجه والله. تو انت وحدين يصفوه. عندي وحدين فطور غير سامع. اي. انت بروحك عندك وحدين يدزم غادي في القاعده. انا تو كلمتهم قلت لهم عدوا حفظوا القاعده ردوا بالك منها. عليه يمشي القاعده لكن انت كان عندك قوه. حتى 10 انفار يمشي يصمد حتى الرصف فوق الرسل. وين تو مبلغ جماعتي.
Fascinating. You see, Saif was the boss. Saif was giving orders. We have information, but this is very interesting because it's direct orders to kill, to eliminate, to liquidate them. And March, all the operation was launched. We collect evidence of Saif organizing the plans in February, but this is new for me. Saif giving direct orders. The prosecutor from Libya say he has this type of evidence.
So how useful is this in any case against Saif al-Islam?
Okay, this is TV, so a court of justice needs to confirm this is authentic.
Yeah,
so
it certainly is authentic, but further checks could be made.
Yeah, we need a witness who explain how the tape arrived to your hands. But this authentic is very interesting because, as I say, it confirmed that Saif was the boss. Saif was giving orders, and the orders include liquidate them and kill them. So both are very important issues.
Okay, that's one. There's another one. How about this? We've also got Saif in conversation with the Prime Minister, and they're talking strategy. I won't play the clip now, as it's quite long, but there is an element in it. At one point, Saif poses the question, should we have human shields? Should we have human shields? He's putting forward this consideration. Is that kind of thing culpable evidence?
When was that?
That was April 2011. That was about a month later.
Yeah, because in April, they were doing Misrata. And in Misrata, it was the first time they had strong confrontations. And of course, using civilians as shield is a crime. It's a war crime. So what he is discussing is, are we committing war crime or not? But also, in the way you described to me, is again Saif. Baghdadi is the prime minister, and Saif has no formal authority. However, is giving orders or instructions or discussing a strategy with him. That's the evidence we have. Saif as a key element in this operation, planning, implementing part of the plan, but then supervising people, key people. The
bottom line is there a case against Saif al-Islam?
Oh, but without your interception, there is a strong case. We have a strong case, and the Libyan prosecutors say he has even a stronger case than us. So we have two strong cases against him.
Okay, and that leads us on to the other debate about The Hague or Tripoli, where the trial should be. The Libyans wanted in Libya.
The Libyans told me that they are very grateful that the court intervened in April, May, because in those days Gaddafi was in charge, but now they're going to show that they can do it. For them it's important because he explained to me Saif is the face of the regime now, and they want to show to the world that they can do a fair trial.
A lot of issues there, though, and not least security. Can you guarantee the security of Saif al-Islam if he's tried in Libya itself, and then there's the issue of judges being got at and witnesses and so forth?
That's a Libyan challenge, but we have to wait for the ICC judges to decide.
Just one final thing. Despite what we've said, Saif al-Islam was a civilian. There were others who could have been indicted, his brothers who were in command of brigades. Why was Saif, and why is Saif such a target for the ICC?
The policy we have is to prosecute the most responsible in accordance with the evidence. When we started the investigation, we found three persons who were the key elements. Muammar, Gaddafi the father, Saif, and al-Sanusi. Muammar and Saif were the planners. Saif also, we have evidence Saif hiring mercenaries because they were thinking that the normal army officers will refuse to follow the orders. That's why they like mercenaries. And Saif was deeply involved on that. And then we have some evidence that Saif giving orders. And then al-Sanusi was the guy who wasn't the planning, but was the guy who was in the street, implementing the plans. Then below them, we have many others. But our office focused on the more responsible. In the more responsible were Muammar, Saif, and Sanusi.
Because his brothers, of course, Hamis and Mu'tasim, were in charge of brigades, and no doubt there would be evidence there that you could find.
Oh, no doubt. There are 1,000 more people that should be prosecuted, but the ICC prosecutes few people, so we prosecute 1, 2, 3 persons, that's it. The rest for the national authorities.
How important do you think it is for the process of transitional justice for Saif al-Islam to be tried in Libya?
I think it's important that he received a fair trial. He's still innocent, we have to prove his responsibility, but I think it's very important that people in Libya follow the process, a fair process, in ICC or in Libya, whatever the judges decide, but it's important the educational part of the trial. My country changed it when we prosecute the generals. People learn what happened through the witnesses. So I think that could be so important in Libya. It's like to create a baseline, a common ground for all of them.
And finally, from the point of view of what you've seen and heard so far about these tapes, from these tapes, how important do you think they may be in the process of transitional justice?
These tapes are great. You should give to us or to the judges or the prosecutor in Libya. It's very interesting information confirming what we have. It's very important to show the direct involvement of these people, because people don't believe that Saif, who was in London going to dinners and to universities, suddenly is giving instructions to kill.
Well, let's talk again with our guest, Jalal El-Galal, who's a former spokesperson for the Libya's transitional government that took over from Gaddafi last October, and Tarek Youssef, who's a specialist in Middle Eastern politics. This issue of Saif al-Islam, Jalal, the transitional government has a very serious problem here, doesn't it? Because obviously Libyans want him tried in Libya, but at the moment there is no defendant. He is in Zintan.
That's right, and he's been in Zintan since he's been captured. There have been promises time and time again that he will stand trial in Tripoli next week, next month, and so on. I personally believe that Saif will not stand trial, at least not in Libya. So the two options left is either he's going to end up dead or probably escape to Mauritania with Abdullah Sanusi. Because again...
Okay, well, take the first option first. So that means that if they try and move him from Zintan to Tripoli, you think he would be killed on the way?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the hierarchy wants him to be tried. Because again, I do believe that Saif al-Islam can implicate a lot of those members. Now, the pattern that has risen is that a lot of the Gaddafi loyalists or henchmen have been allowed to escape. If we take Bashir Saleh, who was in Libya, Bashir Saleh being the chief of staff of Gaddafi's office, was allowed to escape to France. And Sarkozy actually said that we took Bashir Saleh in coordination with Mustafa Abd Jalil. So obviously they don't want any of those men to be tried. Why Saif in this case? So the two scenarios that we have is either he's going to be allowed to go to a place where they have no agreement with the international court, or he's going to end up, I'm afraid, dead.
So either way, in those two scenarios, Tarek Youssef, it's a disaster for transitional justice again, isn't it?
It is a disaster, and it makes Libya's revolution more incomplete. And it feeds into the conspiracy and the sense of justice not carried out in the eyes of the Libyan public. More of these officials have been allowed to run away. They're turning up dead. The truth will never be told, and those who should be implicated will possibly never come to terms with.
But hold on a second, you're both painting a very bleak picture here. This is supposed to be a whole new era for Libya, isn't it? What's going on?
I think it's got to be a new era. It's going to be a new era. I think, at least from my perspective, what I was trying to suggest is the road to the future Libya we both want to be a part of is going to be much more difficult than we had assumed or thought or had hoped. I think it's a matter of managing expectations at this point.
At the risk of sounding more sinister, I think that the Gaddafi loyalists who have infiltrated the structure in the transitional period are actually trying to get back to the positions they held before.
So you're being a real conspiracy theorist here. Are you talking that a counter-revolution is nigh?
No, I'm not being a conspiracy theorist. I'm just telling you the facts that I've seen. It's real politique. These are the people are in power. We haven't changed any of the ambassadors. We haven't changed the people in the foreign investment funds. We haven't changed a lot of the security guys that were very loyal to the Gaddafi. So it is not really a conspiracy. This is the reality on the ground, and this is what's happening. You have to remember, these guys have a lot of money. They had the time. They've got the planning. They can hire the experts to go back to power.
So this whole business of the chief prosecutor saying Saif al-Islam has to be tried in Libya, whatever happens, that's got to be the way it pans out. That's just a smokescreen? Is that what you really believe?
No. I think we're saying it's much more complicated than the public pronouncements. And maybe just to re-emphasize and reinforce what Jalal has just suggested, there is a counter-revolution in Libya in the way that there is a counter-revolution in Tunisia and in Egypt.
When we talk about the secrets that Saif al-Islam has, and those in the country who wouldn't want him to reveal those, and indeed those, I guess, outside the country, within the international community, what kinds of things are you talking about?
Personally, I am more concerned about the internal secrets. Those who infiltrated us from the very start, who actually defected the previous regime only to infiltrate us in order to try to minimize the damage to the Gaddafi system. This is what concerns me most. Now, other secrets internationally, although very important, I have not paid much attention to. But what's more important to me is, in a sense, those guys are traitors, because they infiltrated us with the sole aim of halting the revolution or coming up with the best possible solution for the Gaddafi regime. And that could implicate very high figures in the previous executive team or in the National Transitional Council. So you can imagine the fear of those individuals and at what level they would go to protect those guys.
Now, the tape shed light on one of the major issues of the war in Libya, and that's mercenaries. Opposition leaders issued the warning early on. Gaddafi was hiring fighters from southern parts of Africa to stop the uprising. It became a top issue in the media, and there was a backlash against African foreigners. But Gaddafi consistently denied it. And the recordings appear to support that, at least at the beginning of the uprising. In this phone call to Tayyip el-Safi, the caller said there were black fighters in the Libyan forces, but they were in fact black Libyans.
والله فارقة ومناشرين في كل وسائل الإعلام خلاص هي فارقة.
That is the only reference to the issue, except perhaps this. A month later, two Somalis, Saif al-Islam and el-Safi, are discussing how to stop an attempt to steal Libyan oil.
قلت لك في سفينة خشت تاخذ نفط من الطرق. والله يقولوا عليها لكن هل دخلت فعلا ولا ما دخلتش ما نعرفش. عندهم حتى حرج علمي ان هذا قرصنا عن نفط الليبي. ايه صح. ممكن حتى نديروا حاجه اخرى. حتى الصوماليين اصحابنا. ايه. عبد الله منصور. ايه. ذلك في الطريق ياخذوها.
Well, we're going to ask our Libyan guests about this in just a moment, but first we want to offer a different perspective.
People and the children. I just came from a meeting of the Children's Foundation here.
That's Franklin Lamb, an independent journalist and commentator on the Middle East who covered the Libyan war from Tripoli. He spent the whole time with the Gaddafi regime, and I spoke to him earlier. Franklin Lamb, thanks for joining us. Good to see you there in Beirut. What do you make of this whole mercenary issue?
This idea of mercenary was used by the NTC to whip up international support for their cause. In the West, we have to recall that because of NATO's involvement, without which there would never have been a successful NTC operation, successful in the sense that they ousted Gaddafi. It's another question, as you've raised, whether or not the extent of their legitimacy today. But I think the issue is overblown. I have no doubt that there were. Look, there's thousands and thousands of foreign workers from many African countries. The Gaddafi regime welcomed them in a good basis to have 100 different jobs, and there would have been no shortage of applicants for a mercenary force, but compared with the power of NATO, it was a very small matter.
Did you meet any mercenaries? Did you see any?
I met some Ukrainians, I met some Serbs, we know, but they were technical advisors to Gaddafi's army and certain institutions ranging from the media to IT services. We saw them around. But the same thing happened in the East with the NTC. They had some foreign SAS types, they had the Navy special forces from the Americans, they had British forces, that's been documented, French forces, there were forces from Qatar in there.
I have to say, Mr. Lamb, your take on this is a long way from that of many people we've been speaking to.
You know, there's another point of view, and the fundamental issue that I recall among the population, and these weren't just propagandists, is that the NTC was viewed as illegitimate, that they were mercenaries. Some of the leaders came from abroad, some of them hadn't been to Libya for years.
Let's put that to Jalal al-Galal, former spokesperson for the NTC. From what the NTC was saying, what Franklin is alluding to there, if we were to believe the NTC, the whole country was awash with mercenaries, but it's simply not true. It's overblown, as Franklin said.
Well, we can't ascertain the exact numbers or how many of them there were. But I do remember the beginning of the conflict. We did round up as many of the African workers as possible in Gar Yunus University. Gariones University at the time, and we actually shipped them at night to the Egyptian border. Now, there were mercenaries. As to the number, I don't know. It could have been exaggerated. But I wouldn't go to the extent where, say, it was used by the NTC to whip support. I personally believe Gaddafi was the best marketer for our revolution because he was delusional and he was threatened us with obliteration. But there were mercenaries. I've seen them. I've heard some of their ID cards. I've seen their ID cards.
But not on the scale that the NTC was saying. Because the fact is that in the tapes, as we've just seen, there's very little reference, practically no reference. For all we know, there's no reference at all. And you would think they would say something if there were some there.
The NTC never stated numbers. I can't remember any NTC member actually saying there were 100,000 mercenaries or 10,000 or 15,000.
Okay, Tariq Youssef.
I take with issue with a lot of the conclusions that Frank has made on the basis of whether we can conclude or not that mercenaries were used extensively and effectively. I would not, for example, compare the presence of military advisors sent by NATO countries to the recruits that were on Gaddafi's payroll and were used for predominantly activities that would not pass any measure of international law or could not be justified. Number two, I think it would be unfair to also suggest that the Libyan revolution wouldn't have been successful without NATO's intervention. I think it would have taken much longer, would have been a much bloodier.
That is a conversation for another day, and we will have it another day, I assure you. But for the time being, no question that propaganda was very much part of all this. Propaganda always a part of war, indeed. And after decades in power, Muammar Gaddafi had created a finely tuned propaganda machine. It was a key part of his arsenal. But only now, through the recordings, are the lies and tactics of a dying regime being revealed. Hoda Abdul Hamid has this report.
Throughout his 42 years of power, Muammar Gaddafi crafted his image very carefully. Here, he's the father of the 1969 Fatah Revolution. Here, he's the great leader, father of the nation, adored by his people. And this is Gaddafi, Africa's king of kings. Gaddafi was everywhere, from television screens to city streets. Keeping that image intact was very important. There used to be a poster of Gaddafi there, and it was torn down by protesters, something unheard of in this country until then. Now imagine this. There are demonstrations popping up a bit everywhere. They're becoming more and more violent. The government is trying to figure out what's going on. And in the middle of all this, replacing a poster is a priority.
كان مر شوي خلي عليه هلله والله مانيش عارف كذا انور حصلوه والله حصلوه قال عليه رايكم نحاول ندوروه انور شوي انور.
It's his son Ali who received the call. He was on the streets among the protesters and had no intention of printing one more picture of the man he wanted to overthrow. This was not the first time he had received such a request, but it was the first time he refused it.
I could have had problems, so I just ripped off the cables from my computer so it wouldn't work. 3 people came to me and said we need a picture of the leader. I told them that my machine was broken.
The protest turned into a war, and with the increase in violence, the need to shape the message was even greater, both at home and abroad.
أنا كلهم هنا كم تفاهم إحنا وياكم ما لا بعياد نعم وبعدين تقول لهم ال 16 اللي البارح ضربت عدد كبير من المدنيين في مفراتة هنا ضربت جيشنا فشنو هذه تركية نحن توبا نكبر لهم حتى العدد راح ونقول لهم الوفياتنا لما قالوا يا جماعة احتاجنا احنا نضرب لك في اسبوع ولا عدد كبير.
Surely enough, in less than 1 hour, the Prime Minister delivered the message to the Turkish Foreign Minister.
من الطائرات التحالف مباشرة بعد مغادرة الباخرة وأدى إلى قتل عشرات من المدنيين وعشرات من الجنود.
NATO strikes were seen by the regime as a golden opportunity to try to mobilize as much support as they could specifically when the targets were buildings in residential areas.
المكتبة اللي نستمعوا فيها هذا تاع الطفولة. لا والله أنت ونجيبوا أطفال غادي لكن العشية ونجيبوا الصحفيين غادي. بكرة أنا حتى بنجيب نديروا في جنازة في الساحة الخضراء كبيرة عرفتوا؟ لا إن شاء الله لا. ونبوا نجيبوا حتى توابيت هيك وهيك أنت عارف عرفتوا؟ لا إن شاء الله. ونبوا شباب ثوريين بالعلامات الخضراء وصور القائد.
A lot of effort was put into organizing the funeral. They looked at every single detail, including that the international press was there to cover it. The funeral procession started moving at 4 o'clock in the afternoon as scheduled, and they were heading here to the Hani cemetery. But there was one problem.
قلت لك المقبرة الشهداء الهاني مقبرة الهاني ما عندناش مكان مكان الجثمان. طيب أنا أدير في الهنشير والله. داوتي نقول لك من تو قداش 48 شهيدا.
This is the Hanshir cemetery where the funeral procession ended up. Faraj al-Ghariyani recalls that day very well.
We don't know who they are. There were no death certificates. There were no relatives who later came to pay respect. I know that inside these coffins were just people who died of old age or even mercenaries. They are so stupid that they had the same name on 2 different coffins. I don't know who is buried in these 2 rows. They say it was a NATO, but there is no proof.
As the war continued on the battlefield, so did the information war. Arish Saeed is an outspoken TV journalist who was captured by Gaddafi forces in the eastern town of Ashdabia. He was taken to Tripoli and forced to give full statements on state TV, appearing next to Saif al-Islam Gaddafi.
I was brought here and threatened with rape. It was awful. They wanted to break my manhood. Saif was sitting there. The presenter was here, and I was in the audience. Saif was talking, and he said, Arish is among us. He can testify we did nothing to him.
This was the cue for Arish to speak out. He had been coached by the information minister, Ramadan al-Brikki.
It was the first time I ever wore a suit and a tie. He told me there were 3 things I had to say. Saif treated me well, Tripoli is safe, and there are no mercenaries.
الريش العيد والله قلت لها الساعة 9 اشتغلنا معي حلقة كويسة قلت لها أنا منتجة معينة عورت البارح عورت الواجد ولمسهم هاي عودوا كاميرا كويسة يعني هو العيد طبعا أنا حرصت على أنه يظهر كشخص مقتنع بالكلام اللي يقول فيه ومش خايف من المشكلة هذا أحسن حاجة.
إقرارا بالحق. To be honest, the media arm of Gaddafi was very successful during the war. But they knew it wasn't going to save them. Gradually, the truth was coming out, and by July it was clear they were lying.
State-run television continued to broadcast Gaddafi's propaganda. July's NATO bombing failed to shut down the station, and Egypt never did respond to repeated requests from the anti-Gaddafi forces to jam its signal. It was only when Tripoli fell that Gaddafi's propaganda machine was silenced forever.
Well, it is a fascinating subject, and we'll get more on the whole issue of propaganda from our Libyan guests in just a moment. But first, this thought from Franklin Lamb, an independent journalist who covered the war from Tripoli, embedded with the Gaddafi regime.
We used to sit with Ibrahim Musa and skewer him during lunch on his propaganda. Remember, he was based at the Rix's Hotel. The Western media was there, and they were not all that sympathetic, and they're pretty sophisticated. They saw through some of these staged events. So, and Howard Kane, people like that, Baghdadi, we raised those issues with. But again, the same thing was on the other side. On the 24th of August, I was in the Corinthia Hotel after the surprising and shocking fall of Tripoli. At dinner the night before, Ibrahim Musa said, "Don't worry, we've got 60,000 well-armed troops waiting for the rebels." He called them the NATO rebels. Well, of course, it turned out they didn't exist. My point is that when the Western media then showed up at our hotel on the 24th, some of them, well-known, had been traveling with the NTC all during their campaigns, and they said to us, and they said to me, nothing that the NTC put out from our point of view, or a couple of journalists whose name you would know, was true.
Let's put this straight to Jalal Galal. You were the spokesperson for the NTC, so what do you say to that?
Well, I disagree totally. I mean, when the revolution started, there was no media committee there. And when the journalists arrived, they were not staged. They were allowed to roam the place. So we didn't have a strategy or propaganda. The journalists could investigate, go wherever they want, when they want, anytime they wanted.
But well, we did have propaganda there, didn't we? We were discussing it just now, this issue of mercenaries, for one.
We stated the fact. It could have been blown or exaggerated a little bit.
Well, that's propaganda.
But we never actually gave figures or exact figures because we couldn't ascertain those facts. If you consider that is as much propaganda as we have carried out, then maybe we have.
And what about the issue of Saif al-Islam being captured? Because that came up at one point, and the Western media went with it, didn't they?
I was the media committee spokesman for the NTC, and I could not verify this. And I've maintained that, and it's on record.
So that wasn't a strategic announcement?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. The war by then was over, and we were looking for individuals just to alienate all the fears that still existed. So whoever put that out had his own reasons, but it wasn't the NTC.
And I guess, Tariq Yusuf, as far as the NTC were concerned, they were fighting against a pretty well-oiled propaganda machine, weren't they?
Very well-oiled and time-tested, and they were doing it on the cuff. They were doing it with minimal resources. They were doing it, quite frankly, quite shockingly, with minimal preparation, coordination. Just on the Saif al-Islam announcement, the very individual who revealed that to the world confirmed the day after that he had not verified it, that he received a phone call indicating that Saif had been captured. I think in many ways the ad hocness and the arbitrariness of the revolution is what also made it successful. It made it difficult for Gaddafi's typical tools of repression to track it down, to attach it to a few individuals or a few offices. But along the way there were a lot of these mistakes, mishaps, and in some cases they were quite significant and troubling.
Well, the recordings reveal that the Gaddafi regime members got a lot of their information from international TV news. Have a listen to this.
والله الاخبار طبعا موضوع الجنازه بتاع العشيه هذا كويس ممكن هيأثر تاثير كويس بغيرها. طبعا في احداث اخرى طلعت في قصف في فلسطين وفي موضوع سوريا وموضوع اليمن، لكن طبعا جماعه الجزيره ما زالوا مركزين علينا، يعني الجزيره في تركيز طبعا. لكن المحطات الاخرى نشوف البي بي سي ونشوف السي ان ان ونشوف كذا كذا بدينا نوخر احنا في الاخبار. البي بي سي كم خبرنا كم؟ خبرنا يجي 3.
And helping to keep Libya top of the agenda was Hoda Abdelhamid, our correspondent who was in Libya throughout the conflict. And we're going to show now a clip of Hoda reporting live from the front line when she was suddenly surrounded by Gaddafi's forces.
Yalla. Gaddafi forces, we have to go. Quickly, quickly.
And the reason we're playing that is because it's clear that Gaddafi's regime were paying close attention to our movements. Listen.
والله الوضع في الوادي الأحمر جيد والله صار أبصر منهم مجموعة كبيرة بما في ذلك مناطق الجزيرة كان معهم وفي ناس منهم يعني انتهوا مرة واحدة قالوا لهم كمين كويس.
Now Hoda, you were actually with them, but I'm happy to say you weren't captured. Tell us what happened.
Well, I think that was a moment where you could really see on the ground their tactics. We thought we were still behind rebel lines. We saw the scars going ahead of us, you know, the typical mounted pickup trucks that we saw over and over. They had the independence flag, so we thought we were actually in very safe territory. And during that live, those cars came back rushing again, but there was also, there was a flanking at the same time. So they were shooting all along, and they were trying to push everybody back.
And as you were listening to these tapes, 12,500 of them, it must have been extraordinary to hear your own name being mentioned, wasn't it?
Actually, when I first heard it, I was sitting with one of our colleagues, Suleiman, and I said, was that me? Could you turn, can you rewind again? And we heard it over and over again. And then we looked, we compared the date, and actually that conversation happened at 11 o'clock at night. And that moment quickly, as we call it now, happened at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So we had no doubt that they were talking about that. And actually, some of the fighters we had interviewed had described to us in the report this trap they fell into. And what had happened to them is that these Gaddafi forces, dressed as rebel fighters, let's say, were waving white flags. They advanced toward them, and as they got very close to them, the others pushed them completely back, really, from the desert, flanking, mortars, Grad missiles, just complete pressure. And you got the impression that they didn't want to kill anyone as much as they wanted to push the front line all the way back to the east, and that's what they did that day.
Extraordinary time. Now, looking across the whole spectrum of these tapes, we've barely touched the surface. There's a whole lot more to come, isn't there?
Absolutely. That was the tip of the iceberg. What you get through these tapes is the whole international dimension to it. Who they were talking to, who they were not talking to, how they were trying to garner international support for them throughout the month, and how they realized throughout the month that they went all wrong about it, that what they did was wrong. You had also the domestic side to it. They continued trying over and over again throughout the month to win some tribes over, to try to redeploy to the east. It was a continuous preoccupation for them.
And Jalal, as we look ahead to the next revelations of these tapes, what would you be looking for, do you think? What could come out of these tapes for you?
Well, already the tapes have vindicated our claims, and that is they will go to any length to maintain their hold on power. They would do anything, obliterate anybody, just to continue the tyranny they used to have. I believe that more of the same, who were in contact with them, it could expose some very important members who have escaped the radar so far. Who knows? But there's a lot more to come. I'm sure of that.
All right, Jalal, thanks very much indeed. Jalal, Galal and Hoda, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
OK, you can listen to all of these recordings and more on our website, aljazeera.com, and there we've posted an interactive timeline that shows you what was happening on the ground in Libya and what top government officials were saying about it in private. You'll find a selection of the more interesting wiretaps there too. Just click on the link to Libya on the Line. All right, that's it from me, Nick Clark, and from our guests, it's goodbye.